On Friday the 24th of November, just a little over 1 month ago, a 25-year-old man named Evonte McNeill was discharged from a mental hospital in North Carolina after claiming he thought people were following him, but strangely, he has not been officially seen since. Evonte's mother, Tiana Melvin, would then file a missing persons report the next day with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department. However, it wasn't long before the alert was abruptly cancelled for an unexplained reason. Instead, the case was transferred to the Fayetteville PD, who are mysteriously refusing to comment on the situation. But to make matters even more suspicious, Tiana now claims that the last sighting of Evonte wasn't actually at the hospital, but rather the Fayetteville Police Department itself, where he was apparently asking for further medical attention. However, by the time the EMT team arrived, Evonte was nowhere to be found. So, with the controversy that surrounds this case, many are starting to wonder, what really happened to Evonte McNeill, and could his disappearance be connected to the death of his very own younger brother, who was killed in a home invasion just 2 years prior? Evonte Jacques McNeill was born in the year 1998 in the town of Fayetteville in North Carolina, to his loving mother Tiana Melvin alongside his 3 siblings. Little was known about his childhood, however we do know that he attended Cape Fear High School with his younger brother Kanye, and together they shared a bond like no other. Friends and family would always describe them both as very respectful and loving individuals, and perhaps it was this kind and hard-working nature that led them to be so prosperous in their educations, both successfully graduating from school with seemingly bright futures ahead of them. Evonte would even go on to serve in the North Carolina Army Reserve Officer Training Corps, which was viewed as one of the best leadership courses in the country, preparing college students to one day become leaders in the US Army. So I think it would be safe to say that things really did seem to be going great for Evonte, with the young man eventually marrying his childhood sweetheart, Kelly McNeill, and then soon after finding out he was going to be a father to a beautiful baby girl. However, everything would suddenly change in the blink of an eye, when his brother Kanye would tragically lose his life during a home invasion in which the young graduate was directly shot in the face by an attacker whose identity still remains unknown to this day. But to make matters even worse, after this horrific event had taken place, it was clear to everybody that something inside Evonte had changed. He was extremely devastated by the news, to say the least, and eventually the symptoms began to get so severe that it became apparent to his mother Tiana that he may have been suffering from some debilitating mental health issues that would continue to plague his mind going forward. So with this, it then became somewhat of a regular occurrence for Evonte to check himself into the local medical centre in Cape Fear, as he wasn't in the best mental space and therefore needed some assistance. However, it was during one of these visits that Evonte's story would take yet another dark turn, as this time he wouldn't be checking himself in for having negative thoughts, but rather he was terrified that somebody was following him and that his life may be in danger. And then, shortly after leaving the medical facility, it wasn't long before he would suddenly disappear without a trace. On Friday the 24th of November, the 25-year-old man was walking down the streets of Fayetteville when he suddenly noticed something out the corner of his eye. He turned to look, but was surprised to see nothing there, and continued down the road. However, that same eerie feeling of being watched would quickly return, and so Evonte twisted around to catch the stalker in the act, but just as before, there was nothing there. This series of events continued to repeat itself for a short while, before he eventually decided he didn't feel safe and should probably seek refuge somewhere and talk about his feelings of paranoia. So Evonte then started heading for the Cape Fear Medical Center to see if his concerns were warranted. The young man then received some form of treatment from the staff and was successfully discharged before continuing on with his day. But it didn't take long for those same paranoid thoughts of being followed to return, leaving Evonte petrified once again. So, scared and concerned for his safety, he felt he had no other option than to walk back to the medical centre to seek further advice for his feelings. It is unknown what was said in the medical centre, but what we do know is that Evonte's symptoms can't have been that bad, as once again, he was discharged from the facility and sent on his way. But despite 2 trips to discuss his mental health, Evonte was clearly still not free of his paranoia, and by now he was almost convinced that he was being followed by somebody. So, fearing for his life, he decided to rush over to the Fayetteville Police Department to discuss the situation. At this point, Evonte's mother, Tiana Melvin, states that her son contacted her and explained the situation. Evonte was saying how he was at the police station asking officers to call 911 and telling them that someone was following him, and in response to this, the police had agreed to send an ambulance out to pick him up. Tiana then waited patiently in the hopes that her son would eventually update her on the situation, but as the hours ticked by, with Evonte still failing to contact her, she really started to worry. So, when she woke up the next day to find out that her son had still not sent so much as a text message confirming his safety, she finally decided to officially report Evonte McNeill as missing. On Saturday the 25th of November, the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office received a call from a severely concerned mother, claiming that her son Evonte had gone missing after suffering a potential mental episode the day before. She quickly explained the details of the situation and mentioned how he was supposed to be waiting for an ambulance the night before to take him to the hospital, but after calling the nearby medical facilities, she was unable to find a trace of him anywhere. Apparently, by the time the emergency services had arrived at the police station at around 8:30 p.m, Evonte was nowhere to be found. Tiana also then explained that Evonte was not answering his phone, which was very unlike him, and given that he was a father and a husband, it was even more concerning that he had also failed to contact his wife as well. So, in response to her pleas for help, the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office immediately sent an alert out to the public to look out for the young man, in the hopes that somebody would be able to find him before it was potentially too late. However, to Tiana's surprise, it wasn't very long at all before the Sheriff's Department would abruptly cancel the missing person alert, which stated that Evonte was missing and endangered, and would mysteriously pass the case off to a different police department without any explanation whatsoever. On Sunday the 26th of November, a Cumberland County Sheriff named Sergeant Mickey Locklear announced to the public that they would no longer be handling the case as they had decided to hand it over to the Fayetteville Police Department. The spotlight was then rightfully turned onto a Fayetteville spokeswoman. However, she also refused to divulge any further information, leaving Tiana and the rest of the family completely bewildered. At this point, it seemed the case was now at a standstill, with no information filtering through and no hope that anybody was even looking for Evonte. So, with nowhere else to turn, Tiana decided to ask the media for their support, with the goal of spreading her son's image and story to capture the attention of the public. The Fayetteville Observer was a particularly useful source, as they had also covered her other son Kanye's story back in 2021 when they were struggling to find a suspect for his killing. However, it would seem that just like in the case of Kanye Melvin, weeks would eventually go by with no updates from the Fayetteville Police Department on where Evonte could be or what may have happened to him. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. However, from my research, it would certainly seem that Evonte's friends and family have been working hard to keep his name in the spotlight, and after speaking to Tiana Melvin myself, I can assure you that they will not stop fighting until they finally get justice for their loved one. But with Evonte being missing now for over 6 weeks, alongside the controversial circumstances of his disappearance, the likelihood of his safe return is looking more and more unlikely as the days pass. So, with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. So before we move into the darker possibilities here, As always, I would prefer to start with a more optimistic explanation, which would be that Evonte may not be a victim at all, but rather an incredibly important witness that needs to be protected at all costs. After all, it could certainly be argued that the reason behind Evonte's sudden removal from the missing person alert was because he was actually assisting the Fayetteville PD with a crime, and so the police would have wanted him to remain out of sight. But if this was the case, what information could Evonte possibly have that would have led the police to feel he needs to be protected? Well, one area of which Evonte would have been very passionate about was the controversial death of his younger brother Kanye, almost exactly 2 years prior to his disappearance. After all, it was clear to everybody close to the grief-stricken man that he was incredibly desperate to find the guilty suspect. So what if he had been working behind the scenes to uncover the truth? He did claim that he was being followed that day, so what if he had uncovered some kind of evidence or knowledge that would potentially lead to an arrest of one of the suspects? If they caught wind of this, it would make sense that they would want to threaten him. But to be completely transparent here, there is currently no physical evidence to corroborate this theory, so until that changes, I feel we have to take some time to consider some of the other plausible explanations behind Evonte's sudden disappearance. So, what if he is not in witness protection at all, but instead, over the last 6 weeks, he's been fending for himself out on the dangerous streets of North Carolina? Well, we know for a fact that Evonte was claiming to have been followed that day, as he was discharged from the hospital on 2 separate occasions, and even spoke directly to the police about it. But in my opinion, there are only 2 real reasons behind these claims. Either he was suffering from some kind of mental episode, which was likely brought on by the trauma he had suffered in the past, or he was actually being followed, in which case the perpetrators may have been the same people who killed his brother. After all, the responsible individuals were never caught, so there is very likely a killer or even multiple killers that are still out on the streets of Fayetteville. I suppose you could argue that if he did have this knowledge, he could have just told the police about what he knew when he was at the station. But what if it wasn't just his life that was being threatened, but also his family's? So, maybe out of fear for the lives of everyone he cared about, Evonte felt he had no choice but to leave his family behind, in order to keep them safe. This would certainly explain why he has failed to get in touch with his mother or wife for over 6 weeks now, also despite being a father to a young daughter who he loves so much. But before I continue deeper down the rabbit hole, I must say that this particular theory is quite circumstantial, and does take quite a few leaps to get to. So at this point, I would like to take a moment to delve into the details of another very similar case, which I'm sure many of you will already be aware of. Rasheem Carter was a young man from Mississippi who suddenly went missing just over a year ago in October of 2022, after claiming to the local police department that he was being followed by a group of men. However, alongside the more obvious similarities, there are also many others that need to be mentioned, such as the fact both men were of African American descent, both men were 25-year-olds and also fathers to young children. Both men spoke to their mothers to explain that they were at the police station before abruptly disappearing. Both cases took place in deep South states, and even spookier, both men were from towns with Fayette in the title. I will admit that this last similarity is likely nothing more than a coincidence, but you can't deny the expansive list of variables that seem to be almost identical in these cases. However, one huge difference in their stories is that unlike Evonte, Rasheem Carter unfortunately suffered an extremely horrific fate after his decapitated remains were found a month after the date he went missing. But strangely, despite these shocking details, to this day the cause of Rasheem's death is still unknown, with the police refusing to name any suspects after a year of investigation. Now, I'm certainly not saying that the disappearances of Evonte and Rasheem are directly connected per se. However, these similar circumstances are more than intriguing to say the least, and certainly worth exploring further in my opinion. After all, it is highly likely that Rasheem was murdered by this group of individuals that were following him that day. So, Could Evonte have suffered the same harrowing fate? But just before I move on, one final characteristic that these cases share is that for both Evonte and Rasheem, the police theorized that they may have suffered some kind of psychotic break which led to their strange behavior and sudden disappearances. I suppose you could argue that both men could have been struggling with some kind of paranoia that caused them to see things that weren't there, and then as a result of their impulsive actions, they may have put themselves in harm's way by accident. But if this was in fact the case, what could have possibly spurred on a mental breakdown within Evonte to cause him to abruptly disappear on his own accord? Well, Evonte's own mother claims that he had been struggling with his mental health ever since the death of his younger brother back in 2021, so perhaps the battle had just become too much for the young man to bear. I have no idea how it feels to lose someone in the way Evonte did, but I can imagine what a huge toll it would likely take on my state of mind if it had. But this doesn't necessarily mean he would have felt the need to take his own life, in my opinion. So I personally believe this would be a huge leap to make, especially seeing as we haven't found a body yet. However, a theory which potentially may carry a bit more weight is that the police could have already found Evonte deceased, maybe even shortly after his disappearance, which is why they decided to take him off the missing person list. But perhaps due to the brutal nature of his death, the Fayetteville PD do not want to release any information so that they can track any possible suspects before they know they're being investigated. The police have been known to withhold key updates in the past, so it would make sense that given Evonte's family have been victims to several crimes in the past, the police would want to do everything in their power to catch the criminals this time around. However, before I give the police too much unwarranted credit here, we have no evidence of this being the case, and I can only imagine the pain Evonte's family have been going through the past month, not knowing where their loved one is. So if the police are hiding what they know, I would hope that they have a very good reason behind it. But either way, as a community, we need to continue doing everything we can to raise awareness and to spread Evonte's story, as the sooner Tiana Melvin and the rest of the family can get some much needed closure on the situation, the better. Anyway, with that, I think I'll leave this video here, but if you have any theories of your own which you think may explain what really happened to Evonte McNeill, please leave your ideas in the comments down below, and I will do my best to get back to you. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, if you would like to hear more about some of the other cases that I featured in this video, such as Rasheem Carter, feel free to check out the playlist on screen now.